June 15, 1944. Night over the Pacific. The invasion of Saipan had begun 2 days earlier. Below, the ocean burned with scattered fires from sinking ships and tracer shells vanishing into the surf. Above the smoke, far beyond the glare of battle, the night was perfectly still. A formation of Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers moved through that stillness. Their engines hummed at cruising power, their formation tight and disciplined. The men inside believed they were untouchable. The night sky was their shield. It always had been. No searchlights, no fighters, no eyes could follow them here. Lieutenant Saburo Sato glanced at his wristwatch. 02:10 a.m., time to descend. He adjusted his course toward the faint orange horizon where the Americans had landed. Radio silence, instruments steady. Then, something flickered on the edge of his vision. A faint line of red tracers cutting across the dark. Before he could react, the bomber to his left erupted in a blinding flash. Another behind him burst into flames and disintegrated. No warnings, no searchlights, no sound but the crack of cannon fire from nowhere. Panic filled the formation. Crews shouted into radios, desperate to find their unseen attacker. But there was nothing on radar. At least, not theirs. 5 miles behind, hidden in the black sky, a U.S. Northrop P-61 Black Widow tracked them through its SCR-720 radar, a secret the Japanese had never imagined possible. That night, for the first time, Japan's bombers realized the darkness no longer belonged to them. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a brutal new phase. Japan's empire, once vast and seemingly unstoppable, was shrinking under relentless American assaults. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had become the next strategic prize. For Japan, holding them was essential. For the United States, capturing them meant bringing the Japanese homeland within range of the new B-29 superfortress. The Battle of Saipan began on June 15, 1944, when over 500 American ships unleashed one of the largest amphibious assaults of the war. By day, the sky was filled with carrier aircraft, dive bombers, and naval gunfire support. But by night, a strange kind of silence returned, one the Japanese hoped to use to their advantage. Japan's air commanders believed that the cover of darkness could offset America's overwhelming superiority in numbers and technology. Since early in the war, Japanese bombers had conducted night raids with near impunity. Their tactics were simple: fly low, cut engines near the target, release bombs by dead reckoning, and vanish into the night before anti-aircraft crews could react. At first, the strategy worked. During 1942 and 1943, night bombers harassed U.S. bases from Guadalcanal to Bougainville. American defenders, relying on sound locators and searchlights, were often powerless to intercept them. Fighter pilots could barely see their own wings once the sun went down. The problem was simple but devastating. Human eyes couldn't fight what they couldn't see. Radar existed, but only on large ships and ground stations, far too heavy and unreliable for aircraft. Night skies remained the domain of guesswork and luck. On paper, Japan still had the advantage in darkness. Their crews trained for night navigation, and their bombers could cover long distances without illumination. They even experimented with infrared detection equipment and flare systems. Yet as 1943 turned to 1944, reports began to circulate from the Solomons. And the Marshalls, American fighters, were suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Pilots claimed they were being ambushed at night by aircraft they couldn't see or hear until it was too late. At first, Japanese intelligence dismissed the accounts as nervous exaggeration. The U.S. had no operational night fighters, at least none they knew of. But deep in American laboratories and airfields across the mainland, a quiet revolution was unfolding. Scientists at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, working alongside the U.S. Army Air Forces and British researchers, were perfecting a compact radar small enough to fit inside a fighter aircraft. This was the SCR-720 radar, a marvel of engineering for its time. It could detect enemy aircraft in total darkness, lock onto their position, and guide a pilot to within firing range without ever needing visual contact. For the first time in aviation history, the night sky was becoming transparent to machines. By 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces introduced a new kind of aircraft built entirely around this technology, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. It wasn't just another fighter. It was a flying radar system armed with 4 20mm cannons and 4 50-caliber machine guns. It could find, track, and destroy targets that no human eye could see. The Japanese had no idea it existed, and when it finally appeared in the skies over Saipan, the effect would be immediate and terrifying. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow entered combat in the summer of 1944, just as the Battle for Saipan raged. It was the result of years of collaboration between scientists, engineers, and combat pilots who had one goal: to make the night as deadly for the enemy as daylight. From the ground up, the P-61 was unlike anything that had flown before. It was huge for a fighter, nearly 50 feet long, with a twin-boom design and radar housed in a large, glassed-over nose. The crew consisted of 3 men: a pilot, a radar operator, and a gunner. Each had a distinct role, working in perfect coordination in total darkness. Inside, the aircraft felt more like a laboratory than a cockpit. The radar operator sat behind the pilot, staring at the glowing green cathode tube of the SCR-720 set. He interpreted the blips, measuring range and direction, guiding the pilot closer to unseen targets. Once within 1,000 yards, the pilot could switch to a smaller gunsight radar to aim his weapons with uncanny precision. To the enemy, this coordination seemed almost supernatural. Japanese air crews were taught that visibility was the ultimate weapon, that darkness made them untouchable. But against the Black Widow, their greatest advantage had turned into a trap. In July 1944, as U.S. forces secured Saipan's beaches and built airfields for the incoming B-29s, the 6th and 548th Night Fighter Squadrons arrived with their new machines. Their mission was clear: stop Japanese bombers from attacking the island at night. It didn't take long for the results to show. On their very first missions, P-61 crews began intercepting enemy bombers before they reached the coastline. American ground controllers using radar on Saipan's beaches would vector the P-61s toward enemy formations miles away. Once in range, the aircraft's onboard radar took over. For the Japanese, these encounters were devastating and incomprehensible. Pilots returned from missions claiming they had been attacked by invisible aircraft, opponents that fired from total darkness without searchlights, tracers, or even visible silhouettes. Some never returned at all, leaving their comrades to guess what had happened. Japanese intelligence initially assumed the Americans were using radar-guided anti-aircraft guns or ground-based sensors. They had no concept of an interceptor carrying its own radar system. Even the idea seemed impossible. Their own attempts to miniaturize radar had failed due to material shortages and lack of specialized vacuum tubes. Meanwhile, American crews were perfecting a deadly rhythm. The pilot relied on calm instructions from his radar operator, who watched enemy echoes drift across the screen. Target, 11 o'clock, closing fast. Range 2,000 yards. The P-61 would creep closer, unseen, until the operator's voice sharpened. Visual range! You've got him. Then the night would explode. The story of the U.S. night fighters wasn't just about a new aircraft. It was about how technology rewrote the rules of war. By 1944, radar had already changed naval and air defense strategy, but the P-61 brought that technology directly into combat. Its SCR-720 radar, operating in the 3-centimeter microwave band, could pick up a bomber-sized target from several miles away. That meant the crew could see an enemy aircraft long before visual contact, even through cloud cover or moonless skies. To American engineers, this was the natural evolution of science meeting necessity. The early years of the war had exposed a glaring weakness. Every night, Japanese and German bombers slipped through air defenses simply because there was no way to find them. The development of airborne radar was the answer, and by 1943, American and British teams were racing to make it compact and reliable enough for combat aircraft. The system worked like this. The radar operator sat behind the pilot, reading a screen filled with small, shifting dots of light. Each dot represented something in the sky: friend, foe, or false echo. Through training and experience, the operator could tell which was which. The operator gave quiet voice commands, describing the target's distance and bearing. The pilot adjusted course, closing in until his own targeting radar confirmed the lock. No other air force in the world had anything comparable. Japan's radar technology lagged far behind, limited by shortages of high-frequency components and a lack of industrial capacity to mass-produce the delicate electronics. Their night fighter aircraft, like the Nakajima J1N Gecko, codenamed Irving, carried rudimentary radar sets that rarely worked and had to rely on visual spotting or flares. By contrast, the P-61 didn't need light at all. Its entire purpose was to eliminate that dependence. Its dark, non-reflective paint, radar-guided guns, and stealthy approach made it effectively invisible. To the Japanese pilots, it felt like facing a ghost. Reports began to describe encounters where bombers were destroyed without warning, hit by cannon fire from unseen attackers. Survivors described feeling as if death appeared from the air itself. What made the Black Widow so effective wasn't just its equipment. It was how Americans used it. Crews trained relentlessly in radar interpretation, close formation tracking, and silent communication. Each mission was a coordination between ground radar stations, airborne intercept controllers, and the pilots themselves. It was a complete system, built on logistics, technology, and discipline, all hallmarks of U.S. military innovation by 1944. To the men inside those aircraft, it was a strange kind of warfare. They fought battles they couldn't see, won victories that unfolded entirely on the radar screen. Yet every blip that vanished meant another bomber that would never reach its target. Another convoy saved, another island secured. The Americans had turned the night sky into a battlefield of signals and echoes. By late 1944, radar-directed night interceptions were becoming routine across the Pacific, from Saipan to the Philippines. Japanese bomber crews began avoiding night operations altogether, knowing that something unseen hunted them in the dark. The Black Widow's success didn't just save American troops on the ground. It redefined what air combat could be. Warfare had entered a new era, one where machines could see beyond human limits. And as the P-61s continued their silent patrols, word spread among Japanese airmen. The Americans had found a way to see in the dark. For the Japanese pilots, the arrival of these invisible American night fighters was more than a tactical shock. It was a psychological one. For years, Japan's air doctrine had celebrated courage and instinct above all. Pilots were trained to rely on eyesight, intuition, and coordination rather than instruments. Night flying was seen as a skill of discipline and nerve, not science. The idea that an enemy could find and destroy them using nothing but invisible waves was both humiliating and terrifying. Survivors of early encounters over Saipan and the Philippines described the experience as disorienting. They saw no tracer fire until it was too late. Some claimed to feel the presence of an attacker without ever seeing its silhouette. Others, returning to base, told ground crews that the Americans have learned to see in the dark. In Tokyo, Intelligence officers began collecting reports from across the Pacific. They tried to find a pattern, a new type of searchlight, perhaps, or a flare dropped from unseen aircraft. But none of it made sense. The Americans weren't lighting up the night. They were fighting in it. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy's Air Technical Department, engineers were aware of radar's potential, but Japan's industry couldn't keep up. Copper shortages, inconsistent vacuum tube production, and repeated bombings of manufacturing plants crippled any hope of developing an airborne set that could rival the American SCR-720. Even when prototypes were tested, their range was measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. The cultural gap widened. While Japanese doctrine still emphasized valor and sacrifice, the U.S. military machine was embracing science as the new form of power. Every advancement in physics, electronics, and computation was being weaponized with staggering efficiency. And it wasn't just radar. American night fighters operated as part of a networked system. Ground controllers using radar stations guided aircraft by radio, coordinating interceptions with mathematical precision. The Japanese, flying isolated missions, had no such structure. Once in the air, they were on their own. For U.S. crews, these operations became almost routine. The radar operator would track a bomber formation, the pilot would close in, and the gunner would unleash controlled bursts of cannon fire. Many interceptions ended before the Japanese crews even realized they were under attack. In post-war interviews, several Japanese aviators admitted they never truly understood how the Americans had managed it. "We thought they had a new kind of night vision," one recalled. "We never imagined machines could see where eyes could not." It was a turning point, not just in the air war, but in the very philosophy of combat. The night no longer belonged to courage. It belonged to technology. And soon, that shift would come to a dramatic climax in the skies over the Marianas. July 6, 1944, Saipan, 23:40 hours. The night was clear, with broken clouds drifting over the new American airfield at Isley Field. The ground crews worked by shielded lamps, repairing B-29s and refueling transports. Over the ocean, radar screens in the control tower showed faint moving dots approaching from the northwest. Enemy bombers. The alert went out quietly. Two P-61 Black Widows of the 548th Night Fighter Squadron scrambled into the air. Their engines roared against the darkness, then faded as they climbed to 15,000 feet. Inside the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Robert Bob Tierney and his radar operator, Lieutenant Edward Ted Roble, settled into a tense silence. The SCR-720 radar hummed in the nose, its rotating dish sweeping the sky every few seconds. On the radar screen, Ted saw a tiny blip moving east, a target. He gave calm, practiced instructions. "Target, range 10 miles. Heading 110. Altitude steady." Tierney adjusted course. The P-61's twin engines vibrated steadily, its dark fuselage invisible against the night sky. The radar blip closed in, range 4 miles. "Closing fast." A few moments later, Ted's voice sharpened. "Visual range in 30 seconds. Out ahead, faintly silhouetted against the clouds, the black shape of a Mitsubishi G4M Betty appeared. The Japanese crew had no idea they were being followed. They were focused on the glow of Saipan's fires far below, the target for their bombs. Tierney eased the throttle forward. The Black Widow crept up from below and behind, perfectly lined up. No searchlights, no flares, no noise the enemy could hear. At 800 yards, the gunner opened fire. 4 20mm cannon shells streaked through the dark. They hit the bomber squarely. The Betty burst into flames, breaking apart as debris rained down toward the sea. The entire interception had lasted less than 2 minutes. Below, American ground troops heard the explosion but never saw the attacker. The Japanese never fired a shot. On the radar screen, Ted saw another echo, another target. The crew banked and turned, ready to strike again. This was a new kind of air combat, invisible, silent, and terrifying. And that night, in the skies over Saipan, it changed everything. The destruction of the Betty bomber was only the beginning. Within hours, more Japanese aircraft were detected approaching Saipan. Reconnaissance planes and torpedo bombers trying to slip through the dark. The 548th and 6th Night Fighter squadrons began a relentless hunt, guided by radar operators on the island and in the air. Each interception followed the same deadly pattern. American controllers on the ground tracked enemy flights using long-range radar, vectoring the P-61s toward the incoming formation. Once within range, the airborne radar took over, transforming the black sky into a grid of electronic echoes. The crews spoke in clipped, calm sentences, the rhythm of their training replacing fear. For the Japanese, it was chaos. Their bombers scattered the moment the first plane went down, each crew flying blind, hoping to survive until dawn. Without their own radar or coordinated radio control, formation flying turned suicidal. The darkness, once their greatest ally, had become a trap. Over the next several nights, the pattern repeated itself. Japanese raids that once penetrated unchallenged now rarely reached their targets. P-61 crews intercepted bombers over the ocean long before they reached Saipan, often shooting down multiple aircraft on a single sortie. In official records, these engagements were described in clinical language. Intercept completed. Target destroyed. But, for the men inside those cockpits, it was a haunting kind of warfare. They fought enemies they never saw clearly, guided only by glowing dots on a green screen. The brief flash of cannon fire, the sudden bloom of flame in the distance, and then darkness again. By late July 1944, Japanese night attacks on Saipan had nearly ceased. Pilots who survived described an unseen hunter that seemed to anticipate every move. One report from the Imperial Japanese Navy lamented, "The Americans have acquired an instrument which sees through the dark. Our bombers cannot survive." The victories continued through the Marianas and into the Philippines. P-61s claimed dozens of confirmed kills against Japanese bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, establishing radar-directed night interception as one of the war's decisive technological breakthroughs. For the Japanese Air Forces, it marked the beginning of the end of night warfare. Their pilots no longer trusted the darkness. Every shadow, every flicker in the sky could be death. The night had turned against them, and the Americans now ruled it. When dawn finally broke over Saipan, the silence in the sky told its own story. The Japanese had lost most of their long-range night bombers in just a few weeks. What remained of their air strength was scattered, grounded by fuel shortages, or destroyed on the runways of Tinian and Iwo Jima. U.S. intelligence reports confirmed the scale of the collapse. Radar intercept logs showed that Japanese night sorties, once numbering in the dozens per week, had fallen to almost none by mid-August 1944. The Imperial Navy's pilots, once confident that darkness would cloak them, were now forced to operate in daylight, where radar-directed U.S. fighters and ship-based anti-aircraft fire awaited. The P-61 Black Widow, initially doubted for its heavy frame and unusual twin-boom design, had proven itself indispensable. Squadron leaders called it the Night Guardian, a plane that allowed no surprise, no stealth. Its success also reshaped American air doctrine. Radar intercept tactics that began in the Pacific quickly spread to Europe, where P-61s hunted German intruders over England and the Ardennes. But the real transformation ran deeper than tactics. The Japanese defeat in night warfare forced both sides to confront a new reality. That technology, not visibility, now defined the battlefield. A generation of pilots raised to trust their instincts suddenly faced machines that could see farther, react faster, and strike from the dark. In order to Tokyo, engineers began urgent efforts to replicate what they had witnessed. New radar sets, like the Type 3 Mark 6 Model 4, were rushed into production, but Japan's industrial network was already breaking under constant bombing. The few systems that reached the front were unreliable, poorly calibrated, and often too late. By late 1944, the U.S. had taken complete control of the night skies over the Pacific. Japanese commanders no longer spoke of raiding under cover of darkness. Instead, they referred to it bitterly as the time of the American eyes. In the months that followed, the Japanese command quietly abandoned most night operations. The few surviving crews from the Betty bomber squadrons were reassigned to daytime coastal patrols or kamikaze duties. Their once proud units dissolved into footnotes of the war. For the pilots who survived, the psychological toll was heavy. Many had sworn that no man could see them in the dark. Yet the Americans had found them every time. Captured Japanese documents later revealed how deeply the shock ran. Reports described pilots refusing to fly night missions, convinced that U.S. aircraft carried spirit detectors, or ghost lights. The truth was less mystical, but no less unsettling. It was the unseen power of microwave radar, guided by skilled American operators who could track a bomber formation through clouds, over the ocean, and right up to the moment of attack. The U.S. Army Air Forces took note. After action studies from the 6th and 418th Night Fighter Squadrons became models for radar integration across the military. The lessons learned from the Black Widow directly influenced the design of later interceptors, the F-82 Twin Mustang and, eventually, the all-weather jet fighters of the Cold War. On Saipan, veterans recalled watching the P-61s return before dawn, silent, ghost-like, wings dripping with condensation. Mechanics and ground crews would gather near the runway, waiting to count how many came back. Each returning plane carried the quiet satisfaction of a night's hunt completed. Another strike that shortened the war by inches. By early 1945, Japanese night bombing was effectively extinct. American bases that once kept searchlights scanning the horizon no longer needed them. The blackout drills ended. Pilots slept through the night for the first time in years. The darkness, once a weapon for Japan, had turned against them. It now belonged to America. The war in the Pacific was as much a contest of invention as it was of endurance. The story of the P-61 Black Widow and Japan's failed night raids captured that shift better than most. In just a few months, technology had turned the natural refuge of darkness into a battlefield owned by machines and men who understood them. For the Americans, radar was no longer just an advantage. It was proof that warfare had entered a new era. It erased the boundary between night and day. Pilots no longer fought blind, and commanders no longer guessed what hid beyond the clouds. The unseen had become visible. For the Japanese, it marked the beginning of the end. The very element they trusted most, the night, betrayed them. No amount of courage or tradition could compete with a radar pulse bouncing silently through the air, revealing their every move. When historians look back at 1944, they often point to the fall of Saipan or the battles in the Marianas as the turning points of the Pacific. But for those who flew in the dark, the true turning point was quieter. It was the moment when the hum of a radar screen replaced the beam of a searchlight. When the Americans learned to see without light at all, the Black Widow never carried the fame of the Mustang or the Thunderbolt. It didn't fly in massive daylight formations or bomb cities into ruin. Its victories came one by one, in silence, far above the Pacific, witnessed only by stars and static. But each interception told the same story, that the United States, through relentless engineering and discipline, could master even the night itself. By the time the war ended, radar had changed everything. Tactics, technology, and the very psychology of combat. Darkness was no longer protection. It was exposure. And, For every Japanese crew that vanished without ever seeing what struck them, that truth came too late. The night, once their shield, had become the sharpest weapon of all.